I am live, and I continue where I stopped yesterday. This is Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. It was published in 1977 by STUART HOLROYD, and it describes a journey through the Middle East by a trio, Phyllis Schlemmer, Andrija, Puharich, and Sir John Whitmore. And they're a mottled crew, as they call themselves, and they have been travelling together, and they are now where they are meant to be, guided by Tom, the speaker of the group of extraterrestrials. As spokesman for the Nine, Tom assured them that as you proceed upon your journey to lessen the evils on your planet, Earth, we will be with you each step of the way. This is a time when we shall not be separate, we shall be one. And when we are one, our energies are not dispersed. John had not been able to accept that meditation, particularly when performed by the trio alone, could achieve anything of the nature the Nine spoke of, and even the idea that the three of them, when balanced, functioned as a kind of lens that focused energies from another source, as Tom had once explained, was hard enough. But there was more to it than that, apparently, for in the same communication Tom told them that when a decision is reached by the three of you, from the moment it is made, that decision goes into effect and radiates out from you. So before you arrive here, work that you had decided to do was put into action. The idea that a T field can produce effects in a place in advance of the arrival of the physical body is borne out by the many arrival cases in the history of psychic research, in which a person is seen in a place before he actually arrives. The Vadaga, forerunner, is a phenomenon particularly well documented in Scandinavia, and in a communication of some months before, Andrija had asked Tom about it, and received the explanation. It is similar to what you call astral, or your soul traveling. People are not conscious that they do it, but they use energy waves and part of them projects out. It is as if you were standing here and your mind would go out, go into a wire and arrive at another place. This was a natural faculty, he explained, and was particularly common among the Scandinavian people because of a certain and genetic characteristic of the race, and also because of the energy fields in that part of the world. The human mind, he went on to say, has many faculties it is not aware of. And the reason for the bioengineering work done on all of them was to develop such faculties. Implanted sonars, he said, act as transformers of energy directly from us. In the context of the present chapter, where the concept of energy transfer is fundamental, it is, I think, helpful to recall these explanations. Of Helsinki, Tom said, "This area has its own vortex of energy which we are tapping, and which will then feed you more energy for you to radiate out. In nearby Russia, there were crucial discussions taking place about Middle East policy, and though some members of the council were coming to an area of sense into human mind, they were not yet in the majority. So it is important for these next days that when you do your meditation, you extend it for another period of time in order to bring all the leaders involved into the vibration. In the next few days, more was going to be demanded of them than ever before. Tom told them, and he concluded with the assurance, "You are here together on a great mission. In your minds you could not possibly understand the extent of what you are in and why you are here. You are trusting, and you do as we ask, and this we are grateful for. And though you may not see dynamics, we wish to assure you that what you do is of the utmost importance to the universe. And we understand also that this may be difficult for you to comprehend. They spent 2 nights in Helsinki, during which they held 4 30-minute meditation sessions and 3 communications. Tom had said that when they went out, they should always remain together, which caused some problems because Andrija spent an entire afternoon going from shop to shop looking for a particular type of short-wave radio receiver. This irritated John because the addition to their load of gadgetry was still more heavy-hand baggage, and it was likely to cause them longer delays as they passed through customs control in all the countries they visited. The third Helsinki communication was held at 5:30 in the morning of the 10th of November, just before they left the hotel for the airport on the next leg of their journey to Warsaw. Tom had asked them to communicate at this time at the end of the previous evening's session. He explained, "The reason for requesting a meeting before proceeding with your journey is that there has been a meeting of your government, and a date has been decided for proceeding with a plan. If the Israelis do not commence war on their own before approximately the 29th or 30th of your November, it will be commenced for them." This was a staggering allegation, implying that Dr. Kissinger's peacekeeping mission in the Middle East were a front for quite a contrary policy. But according to Tom, he was not a party to these machinations. "Your Dr. Kissinger will be in a disturbed state because of the decisions of others." When Andrija asked where the flashpoint would be if the plan for the 29th, 30th November were put into effect, they learned that it would be Saudi Arabia, and that the consequences of this aggressive act by the United States would be to mobilize those that are in fact already mobilized and are waiting for the opportunity. "So if the decision has been made to go ahead," Andrija said, "this means that we didn't succeed in Washington." "But remember, the energy can still change that," Tom said. "At this time, though, your physical presence and energy is needed to cover this area. The Russians have not yet agreed to the American plan." "Are they aware of it then?" "Not officially, but they have a thought, and for them to agree, they must benefit. With you in the area, it may be prevented. Your purpose is to prevent." The scenario was becoming increasingly bizarre, more and more like the plot of an extravagant political thriller, a James Bond fantasy. Recapitulating in a later conversation all the bits of information they had had over the past weeks and drawing only the most obvious inferences from them, Andrija and John put together the following version of the alleged situation. The United States, foreseeing that the Arabs, armed with their oil weapon and substantial capital reserves, could soon become a formidable and unpredictable third force in world politics, had decided to seek an opportunity to intervene militarily in the Middle East in order to gain control of the oil. The opportunity would arise if war broke out, and they could move in ostensibly to prevent Israel being overrun. And if war didn't break out during the present period of high tension, they could precipitate it by themselves mounting a simulated Israeli attack on Saudi Arabian targets. Their main problem was what Russia would do in these circumstances. Since World War II, the two great powers had reached many tactic agreements as to where their respective spheres of influence should extend. Agreements reached by a strategy in which the unofficial leak of information in order to sound out the other side's reaction was standard practice. So they had now leaked their plan to the Russians, and if the Russians agreed, the two great powers would in effect share the Middle East between them. But if China in turn intervened, the partition might not be so easily affected, and there could be a danger of world nuclear war. It is very difficult to believe that such a cynical realpolitik could be entertained by a great nation in the present day and age, but such, and unmistakably, was the gist of Tom's reports on the international situation during these weeks. In the light of it, several items that were widely reported in the press at this time are interesting. A military member of the US Defense Department made a public speech in which he expressed strong anti-Israeli sentiments and had to be formally rebuked by the president. Ford himself made a statement implying that the US was prepared to recognize and negotiate with the PLO, issuing it just before Kissinger visited Jerusalem, and thus, in effect, undermining the Secretary of State's peacekeeping efforts. Then the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, was interviewed in Lebanon by an American television reporter, and the interview, in which he appealed to the American people to stop helping Israel, was widely shown in the States. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, it was publicly announced that President Ford was going to meet the Russian leader at Vladivostok, near the Chinese frontier, on the 24th of November. The radio receiver that Andrija had bought was not for their entertainment en route, but for the experimental purposes. Tom had said that Ultima would try to come through directly if the receiver were kept tuned to a specific frequency, and also would try to cooperate in an experiment during one of their sessions. So at night Andrija slept with the receiver switched on and tuned, and during a communication they held in Warsaw, he tried to set up an experiment. This occasioned an amusing exchange. Having checked with Tom that it was all right to attempt the experiment at this time, Andrija said to Tom, "Could you just carry on this interrogation while I get the machine ready?" Tom said he would, but before he could ask a question, Tom put in, "May we first of all say that your term interrogation, we assume, is in error?" Andrija laughed and apologized, and Tom said, "It is the influence of this country you have come into." While Andrija was adjusting his radio receiver, John asked some questions on Phyllis' behalf. She was puzzled and disturbed by the information they had reported to her from earlier communications, to the effect that of all of them, she was the one who possessed no free will. But after the landing, she would be free to choose, if she so wished, to return home. Tom explained, when this being made her commitment to return to this planet, her commitment was for the period to the end of the landing. This was the time limit that at that time she put on a physical existence. Until the landing took place, there would be limitations on her free will, for she had voluntarily turned it over to the Nine at the time of her incarnation, with a commitment which was total and irreversible. But after the event, she would be free to return home, which meant not to her physical home, but to her place of origin. Her commitment, however, would last as long as she opted to remain in the physical body, which the council hoped that she would do, because after the landing there would be years of follow-up work for all of them to do. The period between now and the landing, Tom said, was what your book has called Armageddon, and was going to make great demands on the three of them. Andrija, who had completed his radio adjustments and was participating in the discussion again, remarked that, talking about demands, he had felt during the last 2 days uncommonly tired and drained of energy, and if he felt like this at the beginning of the work, he wondered how it was going to be later on. Tom explained that his physical body had to adapt to working over a larger area than before, and that as more was demanded of them all, they would find the resources within themselves to meet the demands. Sir John would understand, he said, and used the analogy of driving a car for a long period non-stop, which presumably was a reference to John's former career as an international racing driver. The energies they had radiated over the last 2 days, he said, had created many thoughts of peace and suppression of aggression in those in the area of which we are working. John, who still had difficulty with the idea of energy transfer, took the opportunity to express his doubts that the energies they channeled during their meditations could produce such great effects. Particularly as, speaking for himself, he didn't feel at the time that he was giving anything out. "We understand what you mean," Tom said, "but you spent no time and patience to feel, and we would ask you to remember, it is not action always that is necessary, being is necessary." The Warsaw communication session was suddenly terminated when the telephone rang in the hotel room in which they were holding it. Andrija answered it, but nobody spoke, although he was aware of somebody on the other end of the line for a few seconds before the connection was broken. "They must be checking on us," he said, and returned to continue the communication. But Tom was no longer there, and he had to bring Phyllis out of trance. They didn't have an opportunity to ask Tom for an explanation of this event until the following day, when they held their first session in their hotel in Ankara. The journey from Poland to Turkey gave rise to other experiences that they were also anxious to ask Tom about. A suitcase of Andrija's disappeared for an hour at the airport. Phyllis had seen it on the trolley coming from the plane, but it didn't turn up in the collection area, and when Andrija reported it missing, he had to wait an hour before it was brought by a porter, who spoke no English and who appeared with it from the opposite end of the building to the arrival area. Then John noticed a man at the airport who he suspected was observing them, and his suspicions increased when he saw the same man later in their hotel. Could some authorities be taking an interest in their movements? It seemed a preposterous idea, but although their mission was essentially non-political and they were not taking sides in the Middle East situation, they were aware that if their activities were known, it might not seem that way to the respective government authorities. They tended to have different views as to the degree of official interest in them, and consequently how they should behave. And these differences were a part of the interpersonal difficulties, problems and tensions that further heightened the drama of the trip. Tom confirmed their suspicion in the first Ankara communication. He said that the break in communication in the Warsaw hotel was because a bugging device had been activated, and if what had transpired had been recorded, you would have had great difficulty in explaining. They were reproached for being careless in conversation. When you assume that all those around you understand you not, you are assuming an error. Tom asked when and where they had heard, and Tom answered, in places of consumption, which reminded them that they had talked about the work in the dining room in the hotel in Warsaw, and that twice there had been a man sitting alone at a table nearby. Their suspicion that the contents of Andrija's suitcase had been examined at the airport was correct, but nothing had been found. Part of the reason they were regarded with suspicion was that they hadn't been behaving sufficiently like tourists, and they now should spend an extra day in Ankara taking pains to look and act like tourists. They should remain together at all times and be careful what they said in public places, but they would be able to talk freely in the hotel room. Meanwhile, they could continue their good work of diffusing the explosive political situation. So, I'm going to make a break here and continue ASAP. It's the 3rd of March.